In the previous episode, I focused on what I regard as the heart of my Trobriand research that led to publication of Ways of Beloma. That was mostly concerned with the concept of Wicasa sacrifice. It took 11 field trips, 3 or 4 months each, over more than a decade to complete that analysis. But over that period, a number of additional topics came up through discussions with my colleagues that led to a series of adjunct publications. In this episode, I'm going to take a closer look at them. But I must interject something just to let you know, if you haven't already picked up on the idea. A lot of my work is controversial. Either I regard it as criticizing others or they criticize mine. Anyhow, that's kind of going to be the theme of some of these papers or articles that I discuss in this particular chapter. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's just the way it is sometimes in academia. Now, before I get going, I must run through some important background of the Trobriands, to anthropology, and to my style of fieldwork. Since Malinowski's time a century ago, the Trobriands have become the most studied culture on the planet. And that's one reason why everything about them is so controversial. So many people have studied them. Numerous anthropologists and ethnographers have gone there to study a wide range of topics from a great variety of theoretical perspectives. However, practically all of that research was conducted prior to the New Melanesian Ethnography's coalescence, prior to Gender of the Gift by Marilyn Strathern. So when Wicasa emerged as central to everything I was studying, I resolved to address systematically in my analyses the relevant works of my precursors who'd worked on the Trobriands, but from my own perspective. For my first 3 visits, I had with me a small library of what I regarded to be the essential core books and articles. But from 2009 onward, I had a laptop full of the digitized database of published and unpublished Muslim ethnography known as DEPth. It had been given to me by the compilers Alan Dara and Jay Crane at Sacramento State University. Now, I often use those materials in the field to discuss issues with my 4 Moroccan team members and others. We 5 regularly met for 2 or 3 hours at breakfast and another couple of hours with dinner. During the mid-hours of the day, they dispersed to pursue their own occupations. And that was when I consulted the literature, often anyhow, on whatever we had been discussing, unless I was off to interview other knowledgeable informants, male or female, in other parts of the island. My wife, Cassandra, a registered nurse, served as a Rotary volunteer at the district health clinic during the months of my 2010 and 2011 fieldwork. We visited on weekends, usually at her place. Her presence on the island thus afforded me valuable access to new people, especially women, near the administrative headquarters. And then after mobile telephone towers were raised in 2010, my team members and I were able to keep abreast of village developments, and during my absences to discuss progress in my writing of the book and articles. So with additional generous funding from Venner Gren and the Australian Research Council, I was able to consult a lot of unpublished materials at archives in Europe and the US. Crucially, I spent 12 months at the LSE in London reading through Malinowski's original field notes. Now, my auxiliary publications, if you will, like many Melanesians, Trobrianders attribute quasi-human qualities to their main crop, Taitu yams. In 2 papers, The Fractal Yam and Deep Holes, appearing in 2009 and 2010, I described how metaphors of yam physiology, growth, and reproduction fractally replicated villagers' understanding of human agency and the social order at various scales of inclusiveness. Those essays, of course, expanded my earlier use of chaos theory for analyzing ethnographic materials. Now, in 1974, this is another article, the Royal Anthropological Institute adopted a new logo for its organization and especially for its Journals Man, and later Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. That logo is, in fact, a graphic representation of Omarokana village from Malinowski's field notes. Here you can see how the logo matches up with the actual drawing of the village. It was Edmund Leach who actually suggested its use for this purpose, and it was authorized and has been the logo for the JRI since then. Now, at one point, Lévi-Strauss had proposed that Omarokana's seemingly dualistic layout of circular periphery and center consisted in three parts. He seemed to think there was three parts in everything, but anyhow, little more was known of its internal structure. In Omarokana Visited, 2013, I showed that with new data that the village spatial plan and associated cosmologies were actually quadripartite. Big surprise. They were transformations of the fourfold structure of bisected dualities underlying Vecchio village structure and chiefly hierarchy. So here I'm showing a picture, an image of Maipa's layout. The center of the village, as you know, is female, the outside male. And then if you turn it around, outside male and the male and female opposition represented in the clubhouses at the opposite ends of the village are also male and female. But here you can see with this other image of Omarokana, male and female are each divided into two pairs of cross-cutting oppositions. The center of the village is divided into male and female spaces, and I've colored them differently, but so is the periphery divided into two spaces, male and female. So I argued that Lévi-Strauss's famous tripartite structure of Omarokana was quadripartite. In another Cards on Kirawina, 2014, I described Trobriand gambling and other changes that accompanied the introduction of money and commodities. This sort of followed my North Mechio example of Laki gambling. Now, they use the word Laki too. Although Laki originated from the English word, its meaning is different. Under colonialism, indigenous spells and charms like Rakula, fishing, gardening, courting, and so on were based in principles of personal partible personhood and Bwekasa, and they were put to work in card playing. The intent has been to draw upon the perceived powers of good fortune that Europeans called luck. Villages interpreted luck or lucky as being the source of the powers that accrued to money and manufactured wealth. So basically, lucky was taking the place occupied previously by magical ancestral spirits and traditional magic. And some men continued to use indigenous spells and charms adapted for lucky and gambling. I argue, therefore, that Trobriand gambling exemplified how indigenous modes of individual personhood can sometimes facilitate rather than impede social change. Now, there were two critical contexts of traditional Trobriand culture that I was unable to include as chapters of Ways of Boloma. The publishing contract I had signed with Howe Books for Ways of Boloma was for a book of 100,000 words. To my and the editor's surprise, it took some 170,000 words to achieve the minimal analytical goals I had set for myself. So important analyses of Trobriand Kula exchange and islanders' obsessions with yam gardening had to be left out. Well, since then, I've worked out analyses of them, which can well be considered as additional chapters of Ways of Boloma. So, Boloma, the spirits of the Kula in the Trobriand Islands, appeared this year in a centennial tribute to Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific. It describes the magical participation of ancestral Boloma spirits in all phases of Kula activity that Malinowski and nearly all other commentators have missed. When living people transact valuables, their spirits' ancestors do too, since the internal hidden images of the shells are being subjected to Bwekasa sacrifice to Boloma spirits. Typically, prior to being passed along to new recipients, the shells are bespelled and thrown to the ground, which basically kills the Kikwabu shadows or images contained in them, containing the giver's sweat left on the surface of the shells. Sweat is bubaluba. thus temporarily severing the ties of the giver and his or her spirits to the shells. That way, when the shells are taken up by their new human and spirit owners, they are given new life as their names are added to those of prior possessors. Thus, the sacrificial participation of Boloma and Kula enables the successful players to embed their identities in the shells so that they will be remembered for as long as the shells stay on their appointed roads, potentially forever. Now, in the Trobriands, Kula is critical for the status and authority of chiefs. Trobriand Kula is pretty much monopolized by chiefs. Commoners are mostly excluded for trading in it. Thus, the Boloma souls of deceased chiefs are able to achieve sufficient fame in space and time through Kula that they can exist immortally as celestial stars in the spirit world Tuma. They go up into the heavens when they die. They don't reincarnate, unlike commoner people. They're perpetually available there for assisting their living descendants, chiefs, whenever called upon for Kula magic. In the Trobriands, because commoners cannot achieve significant Kula renown like that when they die, they reincarnate back to Boyowa, as we talked about last time. In conclusion to this paper, I showed how Malinowski's denial of spiritual agency led Marcel Mauss to eliminate Wekasa, basically, from his consideration of gift exchange generally, the three obligations, giving, exchanging, receiving, and returning, were missed out. Well, there was a symposium proposed by the Howe Journal in 2020 where we would revisit Trobriand beliefs in the afterlife. Survey research conducted by another group of investigators recently concluded that Malinowski, myself, and other ethnographers were wrong that Trobrianders believed in reincarnation. They tried to show instead that Islanders traditionally did not believe human infants were conceived by returned spirits of the dead. Reincarnation, they argue, contradicted the central theme of Ways of Boloma, that deceased spirits in Tuma served as the agents of indigenous magic. Well, if they reincarnated back to Boyowa, there was no one left in Tuma to assist with magic, they argued. I think you can imagine how the whole edifice of Trobriand ethnography as we know it would have crumbled if that was true. No more worries about spirit conception, virgin birth, fathers of strangers, chiefly legitimacy, and so on. In my contribution to the symposium, which I called Reincarnation Redux, I made the same argument as in my Kula paper, that there are two roads of the Trobriand afterlife: reincarnation for the commoner majority, and celestial immortality for the minority chiefs who dominate the Kula trade. Now, the whole issue of reincarnation is closely tied to Islanders' views of sexual reproduction, obviously. And much of Trobrianders' knowledge about sex is tied up in their beliefs and practices regarding the cultivation of Taitu yams, their staple crop. Trobriand culture has been described as a yam culture, kind of like American culture might be tagged money culture. Indeed, data on yam gardening are replete with sexual metaphors in Malinowski's writings. Still, Malinowski refrained from explicitly linking yam gardening to human procreation. So in my article recently, still in press actually, The Sacrifice of Yams, builds on my earlier analysis, the fractal yam, which can be considered an additional chapter to Ways of Boloma. I describe how successful yam cultivation is dependent on life-giving Wekasa sacrifices that are specifically analogous to the transfer of genital bubula fluids between humans and spirits when they simultaneously engage in sexual intercourse. I illustrate with the most enigmatic of all yam gardening practices. No one, including Malinowski, has ever attempted to explain the compulsory burning of new gardens as an essential step in ensuring yam fertility. Simply put, by firing new gardens, the watery spiritual bubula of cut vegetation above ground and the essence of the soil below, bubulu again, are killed and dismantled with firing so that they can later be refreshed and mixed together and grow yams. So once the ashes and soil are laboriously burnt and then laid up, spread upon a common garden in an even sort of layer, the ashes above mix with the feminine bubula below, from the coral, the burn coral itself, and they fuse, making uh, the garden essentially procreative with male and female essences. And then with the magician's addition of magical spells, the spirit's boobaloo is inserted into that mix. And that's what makes the garden an infertile garden a fertile one. So that's another way I try to illustrate the utility of the New Melanesian ethnography and partibility theory in the Trobriands. Now, over the past century, numerous oceanists have remarked on similarities also between Trobriands and Polynesia. At several junctures in Ways of Paloma, I touched on additional resemblances. And so I'll walk you through a few of them because they're kind of interesting. Polynesian cosmologies typically comprise a pair of incestuous male-female creator gods. Their descendants serve as ancestors to ranked kinship groups, clans, if you will, and totemically affiliated categories of so-called nature spirits. For Trobrianders, the universe was similarly born through the sexual congress of male sibling spouse deities, Topileta the male, Tugilupa the female, husband and wife, brother and sister. Their immediate descendants were the Tabu or Tosunapala brother-sister spirit couples who founded each lineage, matrilineage, populated by living people and deceased spirits. And the Tosunapala also magically created the totemic species, the nature sprites that populate the environment. For the most part, Polynesian societies are ranked chiefdoms. Those polities are typically organized as diarchies, meaning there are two kinds of chief: a high-ranking, passive but sacred chief, and a lower-ranking, profane, political, or talking chief, they're called. Omurakana is led by the high-ranking Tabalu paramount chief, sacred chief, who wields highly circumscribed powers, well, of sacredness. His main work consists in the oration of magical spells on which the life of the society depends. And that's a relatively passive kind of action. He just sits there thinking. By contrast, he is supported by a lower-ranking talking chief called Katayuvisa, of which there is almost nothing known about him in the literature. Now, the Katayuvisa speaks for the paramount chief and actively administers the community's collective projects and politics. The Polynesian religions are famously based in the Mana Tapu Noa complex of ritual powers. Trobriand ritual practices of Wakasa sacrifice operate in accord with analogous ideas of sacredness, taboo, and the profane, or freedom from sacredness and taboo. The highest ranking aristocrats, traditionally in much of Polynesia, previously practiced incestuous marriage between royal brothers and sisters. This was to ensure the highest mana power passing to chiefly successors. At Omurakana, members of highest ranking Tabalu matrilineage intermarry, I would say, quasi-incestuous generation after generation with the people of the next highest matrilineage, Osapola, which is that of the Katayuvisa political chief. As a result, members of those two groups are classificatory brothers and sisters, siblings to each other, which makes their marriages, as I argue, quasi-incestuous like Polynesia. Polynesians divide their universe between the realms of Po or darkness, where spirits exist, and Au, the realm of light, where people live. The Trobriand contrast between invisible Tuma, the land of the dead, and invisible Boyo, the land of the living, is clearly homologous. Now, as Solons famously argued, Polynesian chiefdoms, this is, going back to his work, conform to the model of divine chieftainship. The successors of foreign conquering males in Polynesia marry the daughters of indigenous local leaders. In the Trobriands, polygynous chiefs, like Omurakana, followed a similar pattern, where their wives move in and are taken by other chiefs. Their sisters are taken by other chiefs who then give birth to their successors over there. So we see the annual cycle of gardening in the Trobriands is, let's say, clocked by the movement of that little group of stars called the Pleiades. So yam season, gardening and stuff begins with the Pleiades in one place and ends with the Pleiades in the other. And this is exactly the gauge that schedules the performances of the famous Makahiki festival described by Solons and Valeri, where the community throws off the taboos of the rest of the year, engages in all kinds of orgiastic activities, let's say, until the end of the work season, the end of that season ends, and they return to the seasons of taboo and labor. So the same exact process happens in the traditional Milamala process described by Malinowski, which consists of nearly identical life renewing erotic practices scheduled by the movements of the Pleiades. During those taboos, during the time of taboos, the chiefs are in charge of everything, and the people follow the taboos that go with that authority. But at the times of Milamala, the chief can mix with the people, the taboos are overthrown, everybody can enjoy life and renew it all over again. So Makahiki of Hawaii and other other Pacific Islands are kind of the same things going on as in Milamala and the Trobriands. No, I've kind of gone back to Marshall Solomons' structural history program several times here. And most of the time I've been talking about his theory of change. And even when I've not been talking about his change theory, I have been influenced by them. There were two junctures where we consulted over those similarities, whether in print, in correspondence, or in person, actually. We met many times. While Weza Baloma was in press, I sent him the proofs. And he responded with a draft of his original Political Society, very famous essay that he wrote shortly before he died. And he added a remark, a convergence, full stop. So shortly after that, in his book, The New Science of the Enchanted Universe, an Anthropology of Most of Humanity, and in his other final writings, he placed particle personhood and Trobriand individuality at the center of his analyses, and he was kind enough to cite Marilyn Southern and myself. In a nutshell, he argued that the supposedly egalitarian pre-modern non-state societies which monopolize anthropology's ethnographic record have been actually hierarchically structured, meaning that local spirits of various kinds are recognized as dominant in relations with subservient humans, like Wicasa. That those relations are typically modulated through life-giving and life-taking reciprocities of sacrificial in nature, and that those reciprocities consist of the exchange of detachable parts of both living and spiritual persons. So, finally, I could not be more gratified. However, it was elsewhere that Weza Baloma earned me the compliment I treasure most. And hopefully not too boastfully, I will share that with you. In his review of my book, Fred and colleague Fred Damon declared, and I quote, if the novelist accompaniment to Malinowski's Trobriand writing is Joseph Conrad, he is Herman Melville or Mark Mosko's masterpiece. Like Moby Dick, Weza Baloma has absorbed almost everything in its environment. The book vibrates with dimensionality, making it something of a total social fact in itself. So there you go, unquote. And thank you for listening.